Thank you. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Craig. I'm president of National Review Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you and all of you out there to National Review Institute's Ideas Summit Part 2, Finding Freedom Through Opportunity. Coming to you live from the Greenbrier Resort, where we are hosting our very first Patron Retreat. As the country is opening up after COVID-19 pandemic shutdowns, NRI is finally back on the road hosting events, and we are looking forward to seeing all of you in person soon. First, I'd like to thank my NRI team and the Huel Events Group for their tremendous collaboration in bringing this retreat and virtual conference together. So much work goes into planning events like this, and I am gratefully appreciative. Thank you. And a very special thanks goes to all of our wonderful sponsors. We could not host this event, actually we could not do anything, without your generous philanthropic support. Thank you. Over the last several months, radical progressivism has become alarmingly mainstream. And there is no denying that there is a serious inflection point for our nation now. With the enemies of freedom on the march, we know that we have a role to play in bringing conservatives together, strengthening our movement, and pushing back against the liberal orthodoxies in our institutions. 65 years after William F. Buckley Jr. founded National Review magazine, we continue to fight against the diluted lure of socialism and the aggrandizement of the administrative state. All of you have contributed to the success of our movement, the movement for liberty and human flourishing, so nobly advanced by countless scholars, journalists, advocates, donors, subscribers, and the occasional politician. We are so proud to work with all of you, and there is so much more work to do. National Review has always tried to bring together people on the right. We may have differences of opinion on policies or elected officials, and we live in a media age where those individual differences are often exaggerated and often become bitter contention. But let us remember Bill Buckley's legacy of respect and friendship, especially with those with whom we disagree. We remain fellow citizens. We believe in liberty. We know from our deep experience that the policies we prescribe will provide the most opportunity for freedom for all. We have shared goals for ourselves and shared responsibility to posterity. At NRI, we seek common ground, and we work together in common cause because we know that this is the best opportunity for true progress, as opposed to the socialist mismatch that is labeled progressivism today. NRI Ideas Summit Part 1 reflected on the historical significance of this fight, along with some notable successes and some cautionary failures, and highlighted why we are and we must be unwavering in our commitment to promoting limited government and preserving the ideals of our constitutional republic. Our program today and tomorrow will dive into some of the most important and contentious issues of the day: the illegal immigration crisis, cancel culture, the judiciary, education, economic, and energy policy. Did somebody just get caught on tape saying that pipelines were actually the safest way to transport fuel? We are thrilled that all of you zooming in here today, and those of you who are in this room, are here with us in energy-rich West Virginia. We have a world-class lineup for you, and we are so happy to have many of the state's leading office holders joining us, including Governor Jim Justice, who will address the Ideas Summit tomorrow afternoon. The West Virginia state flag bears an admirable motto: "Mountaineers are always free." You and I are here today because we believe that all Americans should be free, that this nation, conceived in liberty, shall not perish from the earth. Threats to liberty continue to proliferate, though. So preserving liberty, that great task, remains before us, and we, working together, can succeed. Thank you. And so now, on with our program. The first topic is education. We are joined by former U.S. Secretary of Education and longtime advocate for children, Betsy DeVos. She is someone who believes that educational choices and high standards provide opportunities for all children to succeed. After her remarks, she will be joined by Rich Lowry, Editor-in-Chief of National Review, in conversation. Please join me in welcoming our good friend, Betsy DeVos.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. It's a joy to be here with all of you and to see so many longtime friends. I hesitate to say old friends because I don't want to actually age you. But I'm looking forward to my conversation with Rich in just a few moments. But before I do, I'll offer just a few thoughts about where we've been during the last 4 years and where I fear we're headed. I may not be speaking with you as secretary today, but I'm able to speak with the added perspective of having seen exactly how Washington does and doesn't work from the inside. Spoiler alert, it isn't pretty. Unfortunately, government's failures haven't humbled Washington's ruling class. They've emboldened them. And this isn't a newsflash for anyone here. We're at an inflection point. The timeless principles on which our great country was founded are under attack like never before. Those who enjoy freedom's bounty are the same ones who are waging war against freedom itself. It could be a time, as many have suggested, or chosen, to duck and cover, to lay low, or to check out. But none of us here approach things that way. Instead, now is the time to loudly reaffirm our principles, to re-engage them against all foes, and redeem all that makes this country great. The COVID lockdowns are, or were, if you're lucky, in so many ways the perfect entry point into the debate. There's no mistaking this era of unprecedented government growth is about more than the masks. It's about centralized control. As National Review has observed, constitutional government is betrayed when the public is asked not to consult with experts, but to submit to them. Of the many weird things I've seen in the past few years, perhaps nothing is more strange than seeing average people wearing clothing with Tony Fauci's face on it. Or that woman from Michigan, my governor's, pillow with his face on it behind her in every TV shot. Of course, the real objective of liberal lockdowns is establishing government dependency, with taxpayers footing the bill. And we've paid a massive cost already. Look no further than what our kids have been subjected to. The COVID crisis unnecessarily disrupted learning for students of all kinds, and it continues today. I'm sure many of your children and grandchildren know this disruption all too well. These implications on individual students and on our long-term economy cannot be overstated. We're bracing to know more details about the magnitude of learning loss and the breadth of negative developmental impact. It truly is a human tragedy in the making. But I believe there is a silver lining in all of this. The unions, the instigators of the problem, are overplaying their hands. The public's turning on them, and in the end, what they may create is what they fear the most: empowered parents. I'm proud of all the work my team and I did during our 4 years. Every initiative focused on doing what's right for students. While it was a great privilege to serve all students as the 11th Secretary of Education, I must say I was really hoping I'd be the last federal Secretary of Education. And I don't say that flippantly. I say it based on considering objective results. The Department of Education was created in 1979. Since then, the department has spent more than $1 trillion in federal taxpayer funds with the express purpose of closing the gap between the two ends of the K-12 achievement spectrum. Not only has it not been closed, it hasn't narrowed even one little bit. According to the nation's report card, our lowest performers are actually doing worse now than they were a decade ago. I was unafraid to keep pointing that out. but doing so doesn't earn you a lot of friends in Washington or in the media. But continuing to take taxpayers' money to fund the same failed approach and expecting different results is what Einstein called the definition of insanity. My major focus as secretary was to light a prairie fire across America for education freedom, for school choice, for the should-be-simple idea that education is about students, not systems, and accordingly, the funding should be tied to students, not systems and buildings. That the sole goal of public education should be to educate the public. That fire is burning brightly today in states like Kentucky and Arkansas, Florida and Indiana. And since we're gathered here in West Virginia, we must talk about the incredible victory for students that was won here just a few weeks ago. The win was led by someone who knows a thing or two about government limiting opportunities, an immigrant from Venezuela, my friend Senator Patricia Rucker. Yes, that bears clapping. In 2019, West Virginia had 0 school choice, one of the very few states left without even one charter school. Today, it not only has a charter school law, it has an expansive education savings account program that will give access to new learning opportunities to nearly every child in the state. A recent Real Clear opinion survey found that 3 out of 4 families with children in public schools want their education dollars to follow their children wherever they go to learn. Notably, 73% of Black families and 71% of Hispanic families say they want the same thing. Education freedom is on the march, in no small part because it's good policy. It works. It makes people's lives better. Our common commitment should be to ensure that all students continue learning, no matter where they live, no matter what kind of school they attend. This is what our movement must be about. It must be about advancing policies that improve lives. It must be about defending and advancing our core principles. Today, I worry that principles have been overtaken by personalities. Politics now are so often about the people, not the policies that impact people's lives directly. And it's seeping into our everyday lives in ways that, frankly, I don't think are healthy. Personalities are important to point us to our principles, but only when we keep them in the inverse order. Principles as championed by personalities. Ours is not a movement dependent on any one person. Instead, it's rooted in our foundational constitutional principles and their promise to every person in this great land. I hope we reclaim that, and I know the National Review Institute will continue to play a major part in doing so. Thanks again for the privilege of joining you today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thanks, Rich.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I do anything else, I want to thank Lindsay and her team for putting on another terrific event. And just if you have any doubt that Lindsay and her team planned this conference with the utmost precision, they've allotted 33 minutes for my conversation with Betsy, which reminds me a little bit one of Bill Buckley's axioms for life, and time management was a huge thing for him, was if you want someone to show up on time, never give them a round number. Never just say, pick me up at 12:30, because that's kind of a fuzziness to it. And he spent a lot of time lecturing on campus where he needed college kids to help him get around. So he always said, if you want someone to pick you up on time, say pick me up at 12:32, because they'll actually show up at 12:32. So, but I will endeavor to hit the 33-minute mark here. And Betsy, I just want to say, you established over the last 4 years, to what should be the satisfaction of every reasonable-minded person, that you are a courageous, principled, and effective public servant, and we're all very appreciative. So thank you for your work.
Thank you, Rick.
So this, obviously, you hit on your opening remarks, is the biggest issue in education at the moment, which has been the school closures, the so-called remote learning. And there are a lot of aspects of the response to the pandemic that you can see in retrospect were mistakes, absurd even, but were understandable given how little we knew about the virus at the beginning. We were washing our groceries, some of us, at the beginning. Temperature checks, which turned out to kind of be pandemic response theater. But it was clear, based on the research on the fact this virus doesn't really affect kids, the experience of foreign countries, that schools were just not going to be a vector for the spread of this. So how are we a year more into this, still with some districts resisting this? How did we get into this situation, and how damaging has it been to children?
Well, Rich, this is a huge topic for us, and I mean, the bottom line is it all falls at the feet of the teachers' unions and all of their allies, defenders of the status quo, who are in it for the resources, the money, and the control. And we know for a fact from last spring, when evidence was increasingly showing that kids could be safely back in school with different mitigation techniques and factors, and clearly being sensitive to those who had a heightened risk among teaching staff and so forth. But it was happening effectively around the world. And frankly, the teachers' union heads just decided that they were going to play politics with this, and they thought they could really damage, the former administration by putting their heels in the sand and refusing to go back until demands were met. So you still have like the LA Teachers Union, who says they won't return to the classroom until all these unrelated demands are met.
Police are defunded or whatever.
Police defunded, charter schools abolished, their mortgages and rent payments made for them, free child care. I mean, all of these things that are clearly on a wish list for them, but have nothing to do with teaching kids. And the kids have been the ones who've suffered. And frankly, it's the kids who are most vulnerable, whose families didn't have other options to make other choices or other arrangements if their remote learning wasn't working. Those are the ones that are going to be suffering in the long term, and the ones who can least afford it to begin with.
So, as you allude to, you guys were onto this last year, and we're pushing hard, and we're treated in the media and on the center left as monsters, moral monsters.
Like we had three heads or something,
right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So how damaging has this interlude been to the perception of teachers' unions among ordinary parents? We've always known what the teachers' unions are about, right? Very skeptical view of them, to say the least. But an ordinary parent wouldn't necessarily have that view. Has that changed?
Well, I think it has. And I think for many parents and families who have elected to move to what they would consider good school districts or areas where they've chosen to invest in homes that are in a place that they want to be with their kids, they too have been disappointed by how, all too often, how their systems have handled it or not handled it. And they've also been concerned, basically seeing on the remote end a lot of what their kids are being taught, and so this is opened eyes that have not been opened before. And I think, like I said, I think the teachers' unions have really overplayed their hands. And now you see, just this past week, Randy Weingarten, the head of the AFT, circling back around and trying to get out in front of the parade and saying, well, yes, now we think schools should be open. And I think it's too little too late, and I think it's incumbent on all of us who have been championing freedom for students to really help give parents more voice and to encourage all parents to speak up and say, we need to be funding kids, not systems and buildings.
And how much progress has been made on that front recently? How has it played into the adoption of school choice and other programs to empower parents around the country?
Well, just in this year thus far, 10 states have either started new programs or expanded programs, and we're seeing legislation in many, many more states. So it's really, the momentum is tremendous at the state level, and I think it's going to continue. I mentioned West Virginia. I was here a year and a half or 2 years ago, and I think probably many of you recall, in both West Virginia and Kentucky, they had the big Red for Ed movement, where the teachers' unions were striking and demanding more, more for the work they were doing, and claimed great victory. And I think that, again, they overplayed their hands there. The reaction here in West Virginia, when everything was shut down, families really realized what their end game was, and it wasn't focused on what's best for kids and what's best for their futures. It was adult demands, and it was way over the top. And now West Virginia has an education savings account program and charter school legislation to really allow for a lot more freedom.
So what in your mind is the best rejoinder to the common critique you'll hear of such programs, which is that you're siphoning resources or the quote-unquote best students from the public schools in an effort ultimately to undermine them?
The best rejoinder is education's about individual kids, and if we believe that every kid should have an equal chance at a great education and a great future, then we should be sending the resources, and I like to use a metaphor of a backpack. Most kids go to school with the stuff they need for the day in the backpack. That backpack should also contain the resources that are already designated, already spent on that child, to go wherever is going to be the best fit and the right setting for them. And when we change this notion of funding buildings and systems, then when buildings and systems lose students because families are making other choices, they're going to change their ways as well. We've seen this in Florida to a large extent. The more students in a district that are making choices other than their assigned school, the more the traditional schools are responding. And frankly, the better the kids are ultimately doing in those schools because they're making changes that they refused to make before.
So you referred to an equal chance, and one theme the next 2 days will be how the traditional notion of quality is now being distorted into something called equity. And one expression of this you see in the school systems now is assaults against selective programs that have selective admissions, assaults on gifted and talented or advanced placement programs. How concerning is that?
It's very concerning. And again, I think this helps underscore the need for families to have the freedom of choice for their kids' education futures. If every family was empowered with the resources to make the choice for their child or their whatever choice for their child or their children, we would see in a very relatively short period of time all kinds of creative solutions or approaches to education that we see one-offs of here and there today. Mm-hmm. But we would see a lot more creativity, a lot more choice, and that would result in the kinds of opportunities that kids need, whether it's a selective admissions program for a theater arts program or whatever descriptor you might have. And the problem is we are stuck in an over-century-old approach to a very important part of in any individual's life, and we're mired in the past. We have to get through this period to realize what the future can be, and it would be very bright for every kid.
Yeah, so an industrialized system very often run by organizations that are self-interested and are looking after the political and economic interests of the adults,
which we've seen in large extent this last year with the traditional system.
So speaking of equity, another disturbing trend is we've seen the Biden administration do this. There's obviously a broader push in districts around the country to insinuate elements of the 1619 Project into curriculum, critical race theory into curriculum. One, how successful do you think that effort will be? Well, I guess three-part question. I'm like a journalist at a press conference now. I have one question. It's actually three questions. So how disturbing is this? One. Two, how successful do you think it will be? And how, and this is a key thing that a lot of people ask me, how do we fight back? What's the most effective means to push back against this?
Number one, it's very disturbing, and we're not the only ones disturbed about this, thankfully. Again, this last year has revealed to a lot of families across the country what their kids have actually been taught or are being taught, and there's a whole new window into that world that we didn't have before. One of the first moves by the Department of Education under the Biden administration was to put out a competitive grant bid for a civics programming that weighted heavily the 1619 project as a favorable direction to go. I know that there's pushback from members of Congress, and I think rightfully so, because there is a federal prohibition against any kind of a national curriculum. That I don't know how successful their argument will be on that front, but I do know that parents across the country are speaking up. There's been school board elections in Texas and a couple of other places that I'm aware of where this very issue became pivotal, and parents came in and replaced school board members who were actually a part of promoting this type of approach to civics. Again, parents need to know they have important voices, and their voices are strong, and more of them can get together. We're seeing it happening in counties as unlikely as Fairfax County and Loudoun County, right outside of the district, where they are saying enough. We're going to take things back into our own hands. And I think that's very promising. Parents need to continue to raise their voices and get together with other parents to do so.
So one of the most important things I think you did as Secretary, if not the most important, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, is the reform you implemented to Title IX, which will, I think, when people look back to this era in our national life, this will be one of the single most insane things, where the Obama administration, based on what was a letter, a memo from some underling in the Department of Education, distorted the entire process on college campuses for considering sexual harassment, sexual assault allegations, to deny the accused any due process. And we saw these cases where kids had been punished in these kangaroo courts being overthrown by actual courts, and to great outrage and opposition from the left, you guys reinstituted some due process on campus. One, let me ask you, I'm not going to do the three-part question thing. I'll ask one and then follow up. So how important was that?
It was hugely important. It was one of the first things that we started tackling when coming into the department, and we knew that this was something that was going to be tough but necessary, because you're right, the Obama administration had issued this Dear Colleague letter, and then through insidious actions from within the department, basically forced institutions to follow something that was unlawful. A Dear Colleague letter is not law, and yet they bullied schools into following their framework for addressing these things. And so we went about the hard work of actually regulating in a way that has the force of law. And so while there are lots of threats to rescind what we did, and they may well be successful in some areas, I don't think they're going to be able to ultimately undo a lot of the important work that we did to restore a fair and balanced approach that respects due process, that acknowledges that an individual is not considered guilty simply because there's an allegation against them, but importantly also gives the complainant all the tools they need to be able to decide how they want to proceed with a complaint. And it really is both sensitive to and fair to individuals on both sides of this equation, taking on a very tough issue, one we all wish weren't an issue, but is. And so it was definitely one of the most, if not the most important thing we did.
And explain a little bit more why you think it'll be difficult to reverse, because this has a sound basis on law, more so than what they had done? Or?
Yeah, so we went through what's called the administrative rulemaking process, and it took literally 2.5 years. We first put out for public comment a draft of the rule that we had proposed and received 140,000 different public comments, all of which had to be responded to and addressed in some way. The public comments actually helped in significant ways, helped inform some of the details of the final rule that we put out. But this process is one that when it is in effect, which we released the final rule a year ago, this month, I guess it was, last May, has the rule, basically has, is viewed as law unless and until Congress changes it, or unless and until an administration goes through the same type of process again and is able to be in some way convincing that what was done previously was done in error. I think our rule is a very, very fine piece of work, and I'm so grateful to the hugely effective team that we had working on this internally. It was a really, really great group of people, and again, I think we'll address these issues. We'll provide the framework to address these issues in a way that is fair and respectful to all parties.
So that hits on something I'm curious about as well. So in your opening remarks, you talked about how you got a close-up view of how Washington works and very often doesn't work. And how difficult was it to work with the bureaucracy? There's been a lot of focus on the administrative state or the so-called deep state. Did you find most of these folks, if you give them clear direction and make sure they're following through, that they're helpful and they're a resource, you can work with them, or is it more they're resistant and prone to sabotaging you and you have to watch your back at every instance? How did you deal with the bureaucracy?
The bureaucracy is very, very difficult, very formidable, and I would say there were no issues that were easily navigated within the department and between other agencies, like the Office of Management and Budget, and the regulatory piece of OMB. Nothing was easy, never. In no way did anything go smoothly. It was definitely a struggle every step of the way. Now, to be fair, there were some really great longtime career folks that I had the privilege of working with within the department, but most, I would say most in the areas where, where there is disagreement philosophically, almost all of the staff there is definitely not philosophically aligned with us, but very much the other way, and they throw up roadblocks everywhere.
So let's talk about a couple other Biden administration priorities that is kind of easy to lose sight of when there's $6 trillion worth of priorities. There are so many targets, it's hard to focus on everything. But one is some element of student debt forgiveness. One of these issues, as conservatives, it's oftentimes hard to explain, your opposition, because it's something free, that you're being forgiven, that has a natural political appeal. So what are the risks of this?
Well, it's a huge risk, and for anyone who reflexively says, yes, I'm going to sign up for something free, you fail to think about the fact that somebody somewhere is going to pay for it. And I've reminded a lot of folks that think this sounds like a really good idea for, below a certain level of student debt. 2 out of 3 people in this country haven't gone to a 4-year college or university, and we're asking them to write the check for those who did. I think that's totally unfair. It's wrong, and it would be, depending on the levels that they try to forgive the debt. I mean, it would be the biggest reverse action to move resources from those least resources to those most resourced, and it's just a fundamentally wrong approach. what so many folks involved in the whole issue of student debt and student loans refuse to talk about is the cost of higher education and the fact that there are very few, if any, governors on the continued increases in the cost. One of the things that we did that I think longer term are going to reap some benefits and actually provide some competitive pressure to higher ed institutions is we did a whole rulemaking around accreditation, allowing for, which will ultimately result in a lot more ability to be creative and address solutions in higher education in new and different ways. There are lots of good opportunities that do not require a traditional four-year higher ed approach, and so we have got to help facilitate the creation of more of those. And you know, again, the whole, another thing we did that I think is very helpful and I hope will be used much more broadly is added a whole lot of information to what's called the college scorecard. And now you can go as a prospective student and look at what it's going to cost to attend any university or higher ed institution, but importantly, what each program level will cost. Presumably they're the same across the board at an institution, but most importantly, what you're likely to be able to earn if you complete that program. And we know that you know, no matter what institution you go to, there are things that you can pursue that are going to ultimately compensate you better and other things that are going to be less. And students ought to go in with their eyes wide open about those things and take that into consideration. Another thing that I think Congress has got to deal with is this notion that graduate students can take on unlimited amounts of student debt. There is no cap on the amount you can borrow. And the same thing for the Parent Plus loans, which all too often, you know, parents of kids, first generation going to college, they feel they have to help support their child, and they go on and take on debt that they have no ability to really pay back, and that is, I think, a travesty and needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, it seems as though in this area, it's like a hugely important area that should involve policy changes that you're discussing, but also a big cultural change where so many of the people that maybe you don't hang out with, but I hang out with, you know, in the Acela corridor, they look down, even if they don't admit to it, they look down on people who don't have four-year college degrees. It's like the thing that makes you a worthy person in the United States of America, and that shouldn't be the case. Right,
no, absolutely. I mean, there are millions of opportunities that don't require that. And a degree it's a worthy goal, but not as a goal. What does it actually prepare you for? And there are lots of young people going to these institutions today that are in programs that are, who knows what the opportunity, there are no real definable opportunities with some of these majors, some of these programs. And I hope that the private sector will actually use this information and make it much more accessible and useful than a government website can, because this is going to, I think, help inform and I hope challenge prospective students before they begin to take on boatloads of student debt to really shop for and consider what their options are.
So a related question, another Biden agenda item, free college at a certain level. So what's your rejoinder to people say, well, we have free K through 12, free K through 12. Why don't we add another 2 years or whatever it is on top of that?
Well, I would just point people back to the results in the K-12 system. I mean, we are at best middling amongst developed nations in the world. We have a K-12 system that's not producing the results that we would all aspire to see, which is exactly the argument for freeing up those years and that educational experience to a lot more creativity and a lot more providers. And so the last thing we want to do is exacerbate that problem by extending it into free college. Anything free is ultimately undervalued or devalued because you don't appreciate it in the same way as something that you've chosen or make a conscious decision to sacrifice something for, or be take on in a way that you take responsibility for a decision.
So on the other end of the spectrum, there's also a push for universal pre-K, and my understanding of the research is that you can have benefits, especially for disadvantaged kids, from very small, very expensive, very hard to replicate programs. But the research on Head Start, the research on Quebec in the late 90s, which basically had a free universal pre-K program where there were more kids in Quebec than the rest of other provinces of Canada enrolled in this program, it was a debacle. The kids had worse outcomes. For whatever reason, the parents showed worse outcomes as well. So what do you make of the push for universal pre-K?
I would say very similar to the free college notion. We have a private sector that's working very well for pre-K. I think finding ways in your own community to help facilitate more of that for families that might most need that opportunity, but doing so in a way that allows the private sector to be the answer and the provider to the largest extent is the best way to address that. The last thing, again, we need to do is extend a government-run program down a couple more years.
So let me, in the 5 minutes or so we have left, ask you a couple broader questions, if I may. So people say horrible things about you. They said horrible things about you all the time. You're the Secretary of Education. They protested you in threatening ways. A couple years ago, there was an NRI dinner in Chicago, I believe it was, and it was protested, and we all felt flattered. Look, they're protesting us. No, they got word that you were there, so these left-wing protesters showed up. How do you deal with that? Does it bother you? Do you ignore it? Do you consider it a badge of courage? What?
To be very honest, it did not bother me personally at all, because I was very comfortable in the fact that everything that I and my team were doing and trying to do was focused on doing what's right for students. And I guess you don't take fire unless you're over a target, and I think the target is unhappy to have their status quo questioned and disrupted in any way. But I remain so committed to this notion that K-12 education, it's the least disrupted industry, and it is an industry, the least disrupted industry in our nation, and it must be disrupted for the future of our country and for the future of individual kids.
So this has been a long-term cause of yours, obviously, personally, professionally. In any long-term cause, you can have successes, setbacks. Are you optimistic about this cause?
I am, and I do think this last year has been, there's a definite silver lining to it as we're seeing more and more momentum around education freedom at the K-12 level. At the same time, my heart is breaking for so many of these kids who've literally withered on the vine this last year. And my view is we have got to work doubly, triply, quadruply hard to bring more freedom to those families to get those kids in places that are going to work for them.
So, big question. We have an administration, we have a president who a month or so ago decided he's the next FDR, without having mentioned this to anyone during the presidential campaign for some reason. We have an inflamed left that has more cultural influence on elite institutions than ever before. And almost every day, we see examples of what would have been just mind-blowing insanity, just from the perspective 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20. So are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects of America, and why?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, so I continue to be optimistic that more and more Americans are going to continue to wake up to what's been happening and engage in really reasserting and restating our core principles and applying them in their own communities and in their states. And so while I think this next period of time is a fraught time, it is also, I think, a time where we could see some really important positive changes if people really engage and again reassert and reframe and rearticulate those principles and embrace them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Betsy DeVos. You can keep applauding. You don't have to stop.
Thanks.
So, Betsy, thanks so much. We're next going to be joined by Vivek Ramaswamy, entrepreneur and author of the forthcoming book, Woke Inc., Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. He'll be speaking about the woke agenda and the crusade for equity. And then after his remarks, we'll be joined for a conversation with National Review fellow Douglas Murray and National Review writer Maddie Kearns. Thank you, everyone. That was marvelous.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed that, yes. I really enjoyed that, yeah. Great. So thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the woke agenda. So when I was in second grade in 1993, that's when I heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said, I hope my 4 children live in a country where they will be judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character.